So here we have our top 100 N64 games video. It's a long one this time, so I'll try to keep this intro brief. As normal, the usual list rules apply here. Only one game representing each property, unless there's something notable that sets them apart. Import games are only eligible if they don't require Japanese knowledge to play, and games ported over from earlier consoles are low priority. With all of that out of the way, onto the list. Remember to like and subscribe, and please consider supporting us on Patreon for exclusive content and other extras. So starting out the list we have Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. So I'd say it's seen as pretty much a given these days that the N64 had pretty much no third-party support at all. But I think the actual situation wasn't quite as dire as it's sometimes made out. A lot of American third-party companies actually did support the system, and in fact some, like LucasArts, arguably even prioritised the N64 over the other consoles. They provided this very early title for the system during the launch window. The game is a respectable Star Wars outing with a decent story for the time, great music taken from the movies, and actually a decent amount of variety in the gameplay too, with some memorable set pieces, such as the opening section where you take part in the Battle of Hoth and need to topple the AT-AT walkers, which was a very cool moment at the time that would be revisited and improved upon in the excellent Factor 5 Star Wars games. All in all, it's not a game that will set anyone's world on fire, but it was an important early release that's still quite playable. So this was a really smooth ice hockey game from the purveyors of all things sports, Electronic Arts. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, this was the only Electronic Arts sports game to make the list, so there was certainly some serious competition going on for the N64. NHL 99 is based on the foundation of the earlier PlayStation game NHL 98, but with gameplay tweaks, improved graphics, and a few of the programming issues ironed out. Commentary here is a little weak, and given that it was based on the previous version of the game, it was not as in-depth as the contemporary PS1 iteration of the time. But it was smoother and still played a good game of hockey. Dr. Mario 64 is an N64 update of the popular NES puzzle game, where the aim was simply to eradicate viruses by placing capsules of the same colour adjacent to them. This iteration is similar to the original, but of course has the requisite graphical updates and minor gameplay refinements. The best new inclusions here are a bunch of additional modes and an excellent 4-player feature that's a lot of fun to play with friends. This is another pretty good release in EA's Strike series of games, a series which saw a lot of popularity during the 16-bit era on the Mega Drive with the release of the massively popular Desert Strike. Nuclear Strike continues the gameplay style of its predecessors, being an action-focused shooting game with you flying around the stages trying to complete objectives, and generally just blowing things up. But unlike the earlier games, this one gives you access to a variety of other vehicles, providing a little more variety. The game was ported from the PS1 and was quite a late port, arriving 2 years later, but thankfully this time was used to improve this version in a number of areas, with it sporting improved graphics and a bunch of quality of life improvements, making this arguably the definitive version of the game. Definitely one of the better Formula 1 games on the market at the time, F1 World Grand Prix 2 is a polished N64 exclusive from US developers Paradigm. Paradigm have done a respectable job here all in all, and the game was a definite improvement over the original. All in all, the game looks great for the time. It does handle a bit twitchy at times, but it manages to do a good job of recreating the depth and precision of the racing sport in video game form. This was a pleasant and straightforward 3D platformer from Ubisoft. So unlike many of the other 3D platformers on the system, this one is a strictly linear affair. The influence is very much Crash Bandicoot, I'd say, but that's not really a bad thing. It's nice to have some variety in the N64's offerings here, and sometimes you just want to turn your brain off and partake in some pure platforming with no pretensions. The only thing I would criticise the game for perhaps is that it's a little too easy. But still, a nice game with fluid and unpretentious gameplay to run through and kill some time. This one is a vehicular combat game which has you driving around in tanks. Another tremendous multiplayer experience for the N64. Global Assault has fantastic control, a good variety of weapons and different tanks to use, and a lot of different modes to play in too, including a co-op campaign mode to go along with the usual deathmatch and capture the flag modes. The single player here is a little weak and can get repetitive after a while, but it's fun enough in short bursts. But it's really the multiplayer where Battle Tanks shines. Note that the PlayStation title is not really the same game. It had completely different maps and story, and was a much weaker game overall. Iguana Entertainment really stepped up their game with this 2000 edition of their exclusive N64 baseball series. Here they've tweaked the gameplay, improved on the controls, included a bunch more options, and even managed to improve the already impressive graphics, with a notable focus on realism and getting the movements of the players just right. All of this served to create an impressive, intuitive, highly polished and graphically impressive baseball game for the system, and I'd say it definitely has to be the best offering for the sport that's available on the console. This early rally game for the system might not look pretty, but don't let looks deceive you because it was actually quite a fun release with well-rounded gameplay, well-designed tracks and good arcade-style handling. And for its time it had quite a notable amount of options and content too. The game allows you to customise the look of your car, it provides a bunch of weather options and a variety of different modes to play too. The creators obviously put a lot of work into this while still managing to hit their deadlines and get it out on time. It's a polished racer which entertains but doesn't really astound. This was an enjoyable but pretty tough to get a handle on first-person shooter that's kind of like the old PC game Descent. Instead of just a 360-degree view from the floor, like in Doom, these games give you a full omnidirectional navigation of the levels, which can be a bit daunting at first. Forsaken is actually a surprisingly smooth and fluid game with some nice neon-infused art design, good music and excellent lighting for its time. It also has to be mentioned that this Forsaken is actually different to the other games with the same name, and as such is essentially an N64 exclusive. And it was also arguably the best Forsaken of the lot as well. This one was made by Acclaim's T-Side studio, who'd previously worked with Codemasters and made games like the Seymour and Big Nose The Caveman series under the name of Optimus before being bought out by Acclaim in the 1990s. It do some pretty good work with Acclaim as well, with this and Shadow Man being among the more standout of their games. Now this was a cool little N64 exclusive in the Doom series that would later see ports to the 8th gen systems decades later. Doom 64 plays very much like earlier games in the series. You basically search for keys to open up areas while shooting some nasty looking monsters. The graphics here in Doom 64 are very much improved, with new, more frightening monster designs and a lot of spooky lighting effects to keep you at the edge of your seat. At the time, reviewers criticised the game for its use of, quote, dated 2D sprite enemies, which they proclaimed N64 owners were too sophisticated for in the light of releases like Turok. But honestly, these days, without the shadow of progress to worry about, the thing which is most noticeable is how smooth and fast the whole thing runs in comparison to a lot of the other N64 first-person shooters. So Extreme G is a futuristic racing game that has you riding bikes through rollercoaster-esque tracks, picking up power-ups and firing off rockets and such. The game is obviously very much inspired by the popular Wipeout series, but it has a very different dystopian-inspired feel to it, and the tracks have a more vertical, topsy-turvy bent to their design as well. The game is a little rough around the edges and starts off a bit overwhelming, with you likely scraping along the side of the tracks at first, but as you unlock more manoeuvrable bikes and get more accustomed to the courses, this fades away to reveal a game that has an exhilarating illusion of speed and tons of atmosphere, with a lot of really memorable music and tracks. The game also has a decent number of extra modes and a 4-player split screen feature. It's definitely a respectable take on a subgenre all in all. So Nintendo tried their hand at a serious basketball game here, recruiting American developers Left Field Productions, a company previously only really known for the respectable in its day Slam & Jam for the 3DO of all things, and whom would subsequently be charged with updating Excitebike for the system after their success here. The game was known at the time for its advanced computer player AI and reasonably high resolution graphics. And overall it's a fun and polished title. There's a lot of different moves to employ and it looks great. You also get the choice of playing it as a sim or a more arcade focused game, which is also a nice inclusion. Here we have a revamped version of the third Buster Move game in the long-lasting series. The gameplay here is as great as it was in every other iteration of the series, with the added extra here of an excellent 4-player battle mode, which was a rarely seen feature for the series. Overall it's perhaps not a game that reinvents the wheel, but all in all it's still a very polished and well-ported version of what was a classic arcade game. So this title in the Top Gear series is only really a sequel to the first game in name only. Top Gear Rally 2 is actually made by a completely different company and has very different gameplay style and atmosphere, attempting to focus more on sim-style elements, with you having to watch out for damaging your car and doing general maintenance on it. In fact, most of the Top Gear series of games were made by completely different companies, which goes a long way to explaining why there's so much variety between games. The series started out being made by Gremlin Graphics, famous for the Lotus series of racers, but I guess the publisher Kemco must have owned the license, as soon as the 5th gen started, the two companies went their separate ways, and from this point on it would jump from developer to developer. Anyway, back to the game. This one is a good effort that controls well, has a lot of content, and has a great feel with its fluid, drifting action. This is a good port of the classic first-person corridor shooter. Duke Nukem built on the formula laid down by Doom by adding in a lot of interactivity, risque humour and adult elements to the genre, while also being a little more ambitious with the level design. This version of the game plays very well, blowing away the laggy PS1 port, but very sadly is actually censored. The original could be pretty raunchy at times, and that's predictably where most of the cuts ended up falling here. On the plus side though is the excellent addition of a split screen co-op mode, which actually works very well, and a very respectable 4-player deathmatch feature too, neither of which made it into the other console versions. Other quirks worth mentioning are some new weapons, some layout changes and new environments, and some new 3D models for some of the elements too. In fact, if it wasn't for the censorship, there's a very real argument that this could have been a definitive version of the time, so it truly is unfortunate that things ended up going the way they did. Still an interesting version of a classic though. Second Offence is the sequel to the original Vigilante 8 game. The series is essentially a take on the Twisted Metal style vehicular combat genre, with the aim being to drive a variety of vehicles around the arenas, dispatching your opponents. It's all a lot of brainless fun, with devastating weapons and big explosions being the order of the day, and a cool 70s vibe playing throughout. This is a pretty good port of the game. The music isn't quite as good as the PlayStation version, but the graphics and control have been tweaked a little, and there's now some excellent 4-player split screen support too. So here we have yet another excellent 4-player title for the system, this time a port of the hack and slash dungeon crawler RPG. Gauntlet Legends modernised the original game, bringing it into a new 3D world. Like its forebears, it has you moving through the levels, killing monsters, using spells, and also levelling up your character like you did in Gauntlet 4. The main draw here really is the teamwork and camaraderie involved in bringing your friends along with you for the adventure, and when playing it in this manner it's a fun but pretty brainless title. Bear in mind though that the fewer players that you have with you, the less interesting it gets. It really is all about the teamwork. The N64 version here is a good port of the original, much better than the PlayStation version, which only supported 2-player co-op, but weaker than the later Dreamcast release, which included some elements from the sequel. The game's probably not going to rock anyone's world, but given the lack of RPGs for the system, it's certainly a welcome addition to the library. Take the futuristic racing game Wipeout and make it easier and more accessible, and add the Star Wars license, and you kind of get the idea of what Star Wars Episode 1 Racer is all about. The game's main mechanic is a boost system whereby you have to charge by pushing up for a certain amount of time and then let go and repress the accelerator. This allows you to move at higher speed for a short time until you touch an edge or blow up from overheating. It makes for a slightly different feel as you have to have a long lead up to boost, so you really have to choose your moments well. The game starts off a little too easy, but things pick up quickly and reveal a challenging game with excellent presentation, good amounts of content and great courses. And it uses the prequel film's license really well too. So this was a great American football game of the arcade variety from Midway. Not surprising as it was an arcade game originally. Though one thing that is surprising is that the arcade machine itself actually had an N64 memory card slot in it. The game is a lot of bombastic and over-the-top fun, with a lot of memorable voice samples and catchy music. This 2000 edition for the series honed the gameplay mechanics and player movement further, added a bunch more offensive plays, and provided an excellent and much appreciated 4-player option. Like most of Midway's releases from the time, this N64 version also beats out the PlayStation version of the game in quality. I've jumped back and forth on this N64 release from the popular Kirby series a number of times over the years. It made the website's first list back in 2009 and then got removed from the 2010 edition, and now it's back again. This time around I'd made sure to try to get all of the collectible cards and stars hidden within the stages, and I found this did make the game a little more interesting than previous runs. The game's main plus point is its new combination feature, where you can absorb the powers of 2 different creatures at once, allowing you to create a wide variety of cool and unique moves. Some of the art designs and bosses are also very well done. The final boss especially is very crazy and memorable. On the other side though, this is very sedate and easy, even by Kirby standards, with some sections of the game dragging a little. Other than all of that, there's also some respectable multiplayer minigames here to play with your buddies. A nice enough though quite lightweight game all in all, I'd say. At the time there was some speculation, given how popular the franchise had become, that we would be getting a main branch Pokemon game at some stage on the N64. Though it wasn't quite clear yet that it would be a handheld focused franchise at the time. Alas, it was not to be, a fact made even more frustrating when taking into account the RPG drought that the system suffered from. But the N64 did get some somewhat entertaining offshoot titles. This Pokemon-themed sequel to the excellent SNES game Tetris Attack was among the best, being built on the foundation of what was already a classic puzzle game, just now with Pikachu's face plastered all over it. The gameplay here is as fun as it ever was, and there's a bunch of new gameplay modes added here too. Rainbow Six is a tactical strategy shooter ported from the PC, where you have to kit out a team of counter-terrorist operatives, and then direct the whole team one by one to get them into the best position to carry out their objective. The game functions as both an in-depth action game with a stealthy feeling that plays like your general first-person shooter, and a pretty complex strategy game, all in one. A tense and unique N64 experience. This was a very late, enhanced port of what has to be the most important real-time strategy game ever made, Command & Conquer. Obviously a title which created huge waves on its original release. CNC has you mining minerals, building up your base and training troops to fight against the enemy. It's a system that was pioneered in the earlier game Dune 2, but was tweaked and popularised here, and it would go on to inspire countless other titles in its genre, most famously Warcraft and the superlative StarCraft. To make up for the late arrival, and to make it easier to discern between units and buildings on a CRT, this version's graphics have actually been redone in full 3D, and there's some new N64 specific missions too. Unfortunately, the lack of mouse control hurts the game a little, as always for console strategy games really, and there's no multiplayer support, but it's still a fun, in-depth and interesting version of a classic, with respectable additions. Yet another multiplayer classic, and another N64 original that started here but went on to spawn countless sequels over the coming decades. For anyone who doesn't know, Mario Party is a collection of minigames held together by what is essentially a board game structure. Each player rolls a virtual die and sequence, and the characters walk along the map landing on different squares with different outcomes, with the ultimate goal being to collect the most stars. With a bunch of friends joining in, the Mario Party series is a lot of fun, and good for wasting inordinate amounts of time. The minigames are varied and entertaining, and there are a lot of other quirks to keep the competition fierce and close, with the random elements also throwing the game into disarray, and possibly leading to a lot of thrown controllers. Word of warning though, the single player here is an absolute bore fest, so only think about grabbing the game if you think you can get a group of people together to play. With Mortal Kombat 4, Midway attempted to bring the fighting series into the 3D era, whilst also trying to take its art design back to the classic, mystical roots. The game gets some criticism these days from Mortal Kombat fans, and is essentially now the red-headed stepchild of the series, but I feel it's a respectable, though admittedly not remarkable first offering, given the difficulty in transitioning from 2D to 3D that many companies at the time had. The 3D here is more of a cosmetic addition overall, with the game mostly playing a lot like Mortal Kombat 3, but with some new dodge and weapon mechanics which work pretty well, as well as a more concerted attempt at character balancing for tournament play. I quite like the new characters as well, and the cutscenes are memorably cheesy too. Overall, this probably has to be the best traditional 3D fighting game on N64. It's certainly not top tier for its generation, but it still feels a whole. And this version of the game is also generally considered to be more accurate to the arcade version than the PS1 release in many ways too. Which is nice considering what a mess was made of the previous Mortal Kombat game on N64, the butchered Mortal Kombat Trilogy port. This was quite a nice arcade style racer for the N64 that I bought at the time. Back then this was pretty much the only good arcade car racing game available, and held N64 fans over until Beetle Adventure Racing and the excellent Ridge Racer 64 arrived. The game is a nice, fast racer with a lot of style and atmosphere. There's over-the-top crashes, blazing boosters and a bunch of different weather effects and lots of shortcuts to find as well. And it's all complemented by some grungy rock music in the game. Outside of all that, the game looks great with the expansion pack. It must be one of the first to use it well as well. And has good 4-player support too. Ready to Rumble Boxing is a very quirky, fun boxing game that really doesn't take itself too seriously. Graphically it's a vibrant and colourful release. The controls here are well thought out, giving you all the necessary moves. It plays fluidly, and the inclusion of super moves here help to make the game more exciting and stand out against its boxing peers. All in all a great game, and this N64 version is very well put together too. The N64 is kind of famous for being a bit lacklustre for the JRPG genre, especially in comparison to its forebear, the SNES, with very few truly notable ones available for the system. Much of this is usually chalked up to Nintendo's usage of cartridges, with the lesser storage space not being able to hold the huge amounts of data required at the time for FMVs being touted as the main reason, along with the lower profit margins available to developers of course. Personally I feel this is possibly a little overstated. To be honest, Nintendo's relationship with Japanese developers was, frankly, at rock bottom at this stage already due to their restrictive business practices, while Sony on the other hand were being very accommodating and were offering many lucrative publishing deals. So there's probably a few different factors involved. Anyway, I digress. Konami were one of the Japanese companies that did support the N64, and they brought us Hybrid Heaven, one of the few somewhat worthwhile JRPGs on the system. Hybrid Heaven is a likeably cheesy offering, a sci-fi game in the vein of the X-Files, as you're making your way through an alien base trying to thwart a conspiracy to take over the Earth. The battle system here is an interesting 360-degree real-time affair, which almost feels like a prototype to the system that Square would later try out and expand upon in Vagrant Story. You shuffle around the areas in real time choosing different melee attacks and defense options, and each limb actually gains experience independently. Overall, it's a competent RPG. The setting can be a little bland at times, but the game plays well with a lot of unique elements, and the plot is fairly developed and entertaining too. Yoshi's Story is a simple platforming sequel starring Yoshi as he navigates platforming stages searching for fruit to eat. The game is generally seen as not living up to the high pedigree of previous Nintendo platformers, but it's still a game full of charm that contains many of the hallmarks of classic Mario platforming, with loads of fiendish jumps and memorable boss fights to triumph over. Where the game falls down most is its longevity. It's a little too easy overall, and also has an odd structure where the game almost feels like a compilation of multiple short games. In the game there are 4 sets of different levels to play through, and you only need to play through a quarter of them to get to the end. Each different route in the game is made available by getting the required amount of hearts in the previous stage. And as you access and complete these, their icons change colour and levels become available for replay. These different routes, as well as a variety of different mixtures of endings, do fortunately help to alleviate the game's shortness. It's a pleasant game overall, and returning to it after playing so many similar iterations of the new Super Mario Bros. Series is actually quite a nice change of pace as well. The Turok series were an important series of releases for the N64, which were based on a very old US comic book which starred a Native American hero trapped in a valley of dinosaurs. It was a comic that started way back in the 1950s, but had recently gone through a revamp at the time, and had been bought by video game company Acclaim, who were keen to create franchises based on their new acquisitions. All of these Turok games were first-person shooters, but all actually ended up being very different games. This first one was a little more in the vein of Doom-style shooters at the time, with you primarily searching through the environments looking for keys to access more areas. But this had more open environments and dynamic movement, with Turok leaping and climbing through the levels. For better or worse, this also had a lot more focus on platform jumping than was usually seen in the genre, which could admittedly be quite fiddly to get a handle on at first. This first game was also a critical release for the N64, being one of the few notable third-party releases to hold the fort during the N64's first 6 months, and one of the few during this time that was aimed at an older demographic too. The game is admittedly a little dated in comparison to some of the later shooters on the system. There's a lot of close fogging here, and the aforementioned jumping sections can be a real pain at times, but the game's big strengths are still as apparent as they were when it arrived. Running through its environments, jumping and climbing has a really great feel, and it feels much more kinetic and lifelike than any of the other first-person shooters of its time. So very aptly, in the 69th position we have this N64 exclusive Duke Nukem game, made by the ever-reliable UK developer Eurocom. At the time, Duke's creators decided to contract the character out to other companies to produce games, and a bunch of third-person shooters on the PS1 and N64 were the result. This N64 offering was arguably the best product of this venture. This new viewpoint worked well for the character and provided some new ground for him to tread, with the game being a lot more focused on jumping sections and hiding behind cover and such. Overall, the game is a good length, has lots of memorable environments and cool weapons and items to use, and retains the spirit of the character well. It's actually a pretty worthy release to be honest, and is probably one of the better games from the franchise all in all, so fans of the character should definitely give it a try. After Tetris became a phenomenon during the late 80s and early 90s, there were a whole host of attempts to update the concept. And many games that built off of the core concept, like Puyo Puyo for example, really had a lot of success. The handful of attempts to bring the game into 3D, however, struggled to find an audience. The N64 gained 2 of these I actually quite like a lot to be honest, this one and Wetrix, which is still to come. Tetrasphere is quite a tense puzzler where you have to dig into a sphere in order to get to the centre before you crash headfirst into it. You do this by matching shapes, either dropping them to touch each other's sides or lining them up vertically. All the other matching shapes in the vicinity then blow up in a chain reaction. The shapes in the sphere can also be slid around in order to set them up to take out more at once. I find the game quite absorbing actually, and often find myself playing it for ages, pretty much on autopilot. Outside of the main modes there's also some nice extras, such as a mode where you have to solve puzzles with a limited number of moves. A very nice and unique puzzler for the system. I have a lot of fond memories of playing this one. Snowball Kids is a fun multiplayer orientated racer that essentially plays like Mario Kart in the snow. Like Mario Kart, it has power-ups that you collect as you race along the track, but here they are bought with currency that you get by doing tricks when going over ramps and such. As is often the case with these types of games, the single player is not that amazing. Multiplayer is really where it's at. And I have to say that this game almost manages to reach the lofty heights of Mario Kart 64 at times in this area, with my friends and I putting in nearly as much time with this back in the day as with that classic. One of the coolest things about Snowball Kids is that you're afforded the ability to dodge the other player's attacks so long as you can get the timing right, which makes for some crucial last minute dodges and exciting matches. Unfortunately, there's a lot of competition in the genre on N64, so Snowball Kids has to be relegated to the back end of the list. As said, in multiplayer Mario Kart reigns supreme, and while I'd take this over Diddy Kong Racing's multiplayer any day of the week, it's utterly crushed by DKR's single player mode. So Snowball Kids kind of comes off as being a good all-rounder that doesn't excel itself in comparison to the competition, but it's still really good though. What a peculiar and singular 3D fighting game this is. Unlike the majority of 3D fighters, which trace their lineage back to Sega's Virtua Fighter, Fighter's Destiny actually seems to have more in common with the karate games of old than its popular peers at the time. There's not really even a true health bar here, and you can even win a round in one move just by completing a throw or pulling off a special. Everything here revolves around gaining points. You need 7 points to win a match, and each round win condition affords you a different number of points, with the hardest to pull off netting you the most, which in this case consists of you dazing your opponent and then pulling off a quite complicated finishing move. People more used to combo-based fighters will probably struggle at first, as you really can't play the game properly like that. But if you could get into the feel of the game and find someone like-minded, then it's quite an interesting take on the genre. It's really more about bluffing and countering than pulling off an impressive sequence of attacks, and the matches here often have very short and abrupt conclusions that follow one player making a grave mistake. The game is probably not one for traditional fighting fans, but those looking for something different may find they appreciate its originality. Take Command & Conquer, build on it with more options, better graphics, a higher emphasis on story, and more tactical polish with 3 very different, very balanced factions to choose from, and you get StarCraft. StarCraft was a highly respected, beloved title on the PC. This N64 port, the only console version the game actually received, is good, but like most RTS console ports, suffers from the lack of mouse and keyboard controls, and also starts to struggle when there's too much going on too. On the other side, it does however have some minor quality of life improvements, such as making the workers auto-mine after creation, and providing a larger unit selection cap. And it also includes a pretty cool 2-player split screen mode, and the additional Brood War expansion too. Lastly, it interestingly had an exclusive secret level made for it that actually progressed the story for some characters forward, and this ended up being brought into the main canon and mentioned in StarCraft 2. If the game was cheaper, I'd wholeheartedly recommend it for N64 strategy fans, but unfortunately this sells for quite a bit, so to be honest it's really just one for die-hard N64 fans only. Everyone else should probably just play it on PC. One of the weirder and more original puzzle games on the N64, Space Station Silicon Valley has you playing as a computer chip which can attach itself to different animals and use their variety of abilities to solve the stage objectives. The game was actually made by DMA Design, creators of the Grand Theft Auto series. It's a quirky game with a lot of charm, but can be a little slow-paced and rough around the edges at times. Also worth noting, this game is one of the few to not support the N64 expansion pack, so if you want to get it, make sure to keep hold of that old jumper pack, otherwise you're not going to be able to play it. Mystical Ninja is an excellent early 3D action-adventure game starring one of Konami's fan favourite characters, Goemon. The game has you exploring Goemon's world, navigating the overworld and visiting villages while taking on the dungeons that are littered about the land to pick up new abilities. It's all the sorts of things you'd expect from a 3D action-adventure game really, except with tons of surreal, wacky humour. The main antagonist's evil plan here is to turn everyone in Japan into dancers, for example, as well as the odd stage here and there where you jump into a huge mech, which has its own over-the-top introductory song I might add. The game has a lot more focus on platforming than, say, the Zelda games, and it has a good balance of action and adventuring. Given its age, the camera can be a little bit of a problem at times, but honestly, it's a very likeable game overall. It's just a totally mad, fun and accessible adventure outing, where there's always something crazy around every corner, and those who love wacky, nonsensical Japanese humour should definitely check it out. Hydro Thunder is a colourful, fun and attractive looking powerboat racing game with excellent handling and controls, a port of the Midway arcade game. The game is you collecting power-ups to fill up a boost gauge to speed your way through the courses, searching for shortcuts along the way. The game was admittedly available for most consoles at the time, with the PS1 version being slightly weaker than this, and a Dreamcast version, which was a launch title for that system, being the standout version. But this was the only one that had a 4-player split screen option. Graphically it's also highly impressive. It really showed what the system could do in the right hands. This is actually a surprisingly nice arcade-style racer, with a well-judged difficulty curve and colourful environments with jaw-dropping visuals, filled with a lot of detail and nice small touches. It's from the French company Titus, who generally made some pretty bad games, truth be told, but did have some success with the racing genre, which this continues, with the Commodore Amiga's excellent Crazy Cars 3 being the company's standout release. It's generally a sunny, lightweight and enjoyable game which looks great and is fun to play too. Note that this is by far the best version of the game out there too, and it's easy to tell that this was the main target format for the game during its development. I hate to admit it, but this game, that has you taking photos of Pokemon, was a game I feel I never gave a proper chance to, always writing it off as a sort of gimmick game. But playing through it again for this list, I find it to be a likeable and unique game based on a popular license, that still retains some of what made said series so beloved, even though it's a radically different type of game. The game kind of plays like a light gun game controlled via analog stick, but that explanation really doesn't quite do it justice, as there's a bunch of other elements to the game as well. Instead of shooting, you're taking photos here, and the game affords points to your picture based on how close to the camera and central the subject is, and whether they're facing the camera or not, which lends the game a very different feel. You can also throw objects at the subject to get their attention, and can open up new routes by completing simple objectives. You spend a lot of the time waiting for the opportunity to get the perfect photo and replaying the levels looking for Pokemon you might have missed the first time around. Collecting photos of every Pokemon can be a compulsive experience, and in general the game is just unique fun really. This was a fun Mario-themed golf game made by developer Camelot, a company known for their popular Hot Shots Golf series on the PlayStation. And to be honest, Mario Golf practically is a Hot Shots game, just starring Nintendo's famous characters. The game is accessible and easy to get into, but still has the kind of depth required for a golf game, with wind direction and weather conditions playing an active part. It's got a lot of charm, and I've got some good memories of playing this with my friends and brother at the time, with us all trying to annoy each other and put each other off of our shots by incessantly repeating the aggravating voice samples in the game. This is a cool and innovative puzzle game that's a little rough around the edges. Glover successfully brought back the ball rolling mechanics from games like Marble Madness and Spin Dizzy and such, and then combined them with the 5th generation 3D platformer sensibilities of Mario 64. In the game you play as a glove that can walk around, jump and ground pound, but it also attaches to and manipulates a rubber ball which needs to be taken to the end of the stage, with navigation being based around rolling, throwing and bouncing said ball. The game is not the easiest to get the hang of and is quite finicky, so it's not going to be for everyone. This is a game that really requires patience, but it's actually a unique and rewarding game to learn, and actually, arguably it led to a short resurgence in the genre too. Sega's subsequent GameCube offering, Billy Hatcher, especially seems heavily inspired by this. Last thing probably worth noting is, avoid the PlayStation version of this game at all cost. It was an absolutely abysmal port of the game, very rushed and with numerous downgrades to gameplay and graphics. Treasure ended up making a total of 3 games for the N64, and as can be expected of a company with such high pedigree, all of them ended up being pretty much stone cold classics. Bangai-O here is a unique, frantic and just plain crazy shmup where you pilot a hovering mech through a bunch of different stages, shooting anything that moves and swapping between 2 weapons types to progress. The game controls well, with you being able to fire in any direction and move independently, and from start to finish it never stops being hectic and exciting. Unfortunately, the game was a Japan-only release on N64, so I expect a lot of Japanese story text, but it doesn't really affect the gameplay, and honestly the plotline is so nonsensical in this game that it's difficult to understand what's going on even when it is in English, like the later, heavily revised Sega Dreamcast version was. So Rage Wars was an offshoot for the Turok series that was basically a mixture of Turok 2 and the then popular arena-based FPS games of the time, such as Quake 3 Arena and Unreal Tournament. There's no real story mode involved here, with the game being focused entirely on deathmatch play, whether it's being experienced in single player against bots or multiplayer with friends. There's some advantages to doing it this way, the main one being that the developers were free to focus on crafting interesting multiplayer levels, filled with places to hide and take each other by surprise and such. The frame rate here is also much more consistent and polished than in the other games of the series too. Outside of the 2 main modes, there's also some co-op options and a nice variety of extra game types like Capture the Flag, as well as a mode where one player is turned into a weak creature and hunted by the other players, which my friends and I would get a lot of play out of back in the day. One interesting piece of trivia about the Turok developers is that many of the people who worked on it would actually go on to form the core of the company Retro Studios, after leaving the company and going their own way with financial support from Nintendo. And actually this particular game especially had a lot of people who would later make up the core of the Metroid Prime team. Though a few people from the 2nd and 3rd Turok games would also move on to the Metroid Prime series and its sequels. Anyway, as a multiplayer FPS, I'd say this is easily the main competition for Rareware's incredible releases on the N64, with Rage Wars admirably managing to hold its own against classics like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark in a specific area, but never really reaching the same level of popularity. Its weapons were especially a lot of fun to use. One of the genres the N64 really struggled with was fighting games. Luckily, Konami's Rakuga Kids, which went unreleased in the US unfortunately, just about feels the classic 2D fighter void. Rakuga Kids essentially plays like a Konami version of Capcom's X-Men Children of the Atom arcade game. The game has all the usual Street Fighter 2 quarter turns and combos, but with updated gameplay mechanics like high jumps and aerial raves, bringing it more into line with its contemporaries. It's not quite up to the standards of Capcom's classic offerings of course, but it has a few of its own features that mix things up a little, such as the game's super moves being split into offense, defense or combos, and the game actually has an awful lot of charm too, and a lot of over-the-top styling. Here we have a 2.5D update of the classic series that had you racing miniature cars through huge real-world environments, such as oversized snooker tables, ponds and garden paths and such. A series that found a ton of success on the Mega Drive with its excellent second offering. This particular one here is actually a port of the PlayStation game Micro Machines V3, which on top of the aforementioned switch to 3D polygons, sported a huge number of tracks and a large variety of different vehicles, including tanks and such, and even offered a crazy 8-player simultaneous option where everyone shared a controller. As a port, this N64 version is quite a reasonable one. They added a number of turbo settings a la Street Fighter to make the game faster, and a couple of extra modes too, while there's not really that many noticeable trade-offs either. With the third game in the San Francisco Rush series, the game's creators Atari, who at this stage were completely owned by Midway but were allowed to largely carry on as a separate entity, eschewed any kind of pretense of realism and went straight for over-the-top futuristic action. This was a wise choice all in all, as this change, coupled with a general honing of the gameplay mechanics, provided a game that was a huge improvement over its often dodgy predecessors. The game looks great and even has some improvements to the arcade original too, such as the new wings which give you the ability to stabilise yourself more in mid-air. All in all, Rush 2049 was the best game from the whole series. It had a big focus on elaborate shortcuts, over-the-top crashes and huge leaps. So expect loads of close calls and corkscrews through the air as you careen through its imaginative futuristic cities. So this one plays like a pseudo-sequel to Factor 5's earlier game, Rogue Squadron, except this time using the prequel license, making it a branch off of sorts I guess. Battle for Naboo, like its predecessor, has you piloting a variety of craft trying to fulfill specific mission objectives while shooting down enemy vehicles along the way. The main change here is that unlike Rogue Squadron, which was primarily about flying dogfights, Battle for Naboo adds in a lot of new ground-based missions. The graphics and sound here are phenomenal, and not only improve on the earlier game, but actually stand as some of the most impressive for the N64 in general, with an excellent draw distance, level of detail and near CD quality music somehow. Where the gameplay is concerned, I'd say this is a little more polished than Rogue Squadron, but it's a lot later, less notable, and the premise is a little weaker as well. After the huge success that was Doom, developers id Software decided to go medieval for their highly publicised successor, Quake. Quake is a corridor first-person shooter where the aim is pretty simple: kill monsters and find switches and keys to open doors. It didn't quite live up to the sky-high expectations for it, with actually its most important contributions to the genre arguably coming from its fan-created mods, not the original game. But the game itself was still exciting, gory, brainless fun. Monsters are grotesque and do their best to make you jump out of your seat in fear, and the atmosphere is thick, creepy, and feels almost Clive Barker inspired. The N64 port, whom id tasked to Midway after being impressed with the team's Doom 64, is pretty good. The texturing is simplified and indistinct. Make sure to turn off the filtering in the options, but everything that matters is there, and the game is fast and smooth, and its water and sky effects were improved from the PC original too. So as said in the earlier Turok Rage Wars entry, much of the core of Retro Studios' staff actually came from the company Iguana Entertainment, creators of the Turok series. And I feel like we can see a lot of influence in Metroid Prime from this second game especially, with this particular Turok being a more non-linear, objective-based first-person shooter that has you really having to fully explore the large environments. And with art design based around a mix of sci-fi and mysticism too, which is also somewhat reminiscent of Metroid Prime in some respects. The game has some very impressive graphics at the time, is packed with over-the-top gore and some of the coolest weapons to ever grace an FPS, and has a lot of memorable set pieces too, such as riding around on the back of an armoured Triceratops. It was a truly standout first-person shooter release for the system, but sadly I think it's now become quite dated, and believe me, I generally dislike this sort of criticism when levelled towards retro games, but I feel it has to be said here. It's very difficult to navigate the levels here, with you regularly getting lost, and the frame rate is very unreliable. So honestly, most people would likely be better served with a PC port of the game, truth be told. But anyone wanting to experience this original N64 game will still find it remains a unique and worthwhile gameplay experience on the system, and an interesting slice of video game history. After the earlier Mystical Ninja Star and Goemon attempted an ambitious fully 3D game, the second Goemon title on the N64 went back to the classic 2D formula of the earlier SNES classics, except now with a new polygonal 2.5D look. And actually, I'd say it stands as one of the best of these action-packed Goemon games ever released. The game is a fast action-adventure title that has you slashing and jumping your way through fiendish stages, avoiding hazards and dispatching the multitude of enemies blocking your way. The classic 2D action here is well done and challenging, the music is catchy and memorable, the humour and charm the series is famous for is still here in spades, and it's not only a great 2-player co-op feature here, there's actually a secret 4-player co-op feature too. Another great underrated third-party offering for the system. For me, this was simply one of the best footy games of the time, and I probably spent more time with this than any other football game. International Superstar Soccer 64 was a fast, smooth and responsive title with loads of moves and very accessible and intuitive gameplay. The analog control was fantastic at the time, and there were a whole load of customisation options too, which I spent a lot of time messing about with when I first got the game back in 1997. The game was well ahead of the competition when first released, and dominated the landscape until the release of its own sequel, ISS Pro 98, hit the PlayStation more than a year later. Always one of the better Tetris-style games to come out, the Puyo Puyo series featured an excellent core system which ended up working very well for comboing and competitive play. The game has you matching coloured blobs to remove them from the field before they build up and kill you. If you set the blobs up to create chain reactions, as they're removed you can send them to your opponent as garbage to get in their way. This one added in the titular sun mechanic, whereby getting rid of the oncoming junk Puyo coming from your opponent creates sun Puyo that can be cleared to create even more problems for your competitor. This third game in the series also made a lot of presentation improvements, though the presentation here in this N64 version is slightly weaker than the others due to the removal of the FMV intro movie. But hey, the new cutscene here is still nice, and at least the game loads faster too. Easily one of the best arcade-style races on the N64, Beetle Adventure Racing focuses on uncomplicated fun and colourful, imaginative courses filled with secrets to discover. The game is infused with a quirky, unserious vibe, with you racing through courses populated with things like dinosaurs and UFOs, and your car careening off of ski jumps and such. There's a lot of content here to keep racing fans busy, including a 4-player battle mode, and due to its offbeat nature, it's actually aged pretty well too. The frame rate's not super great, as can be expected for the era of course, but the game itself still feels quite unique, even after all these years. So here we have the Castlevania games, which I've lumped together in this entry as the second N64 game, Legacy of Darkness, is almost like a remake of the first in many ways, with the characters and adventure of the original N64 release being included here as extra content, though in a slightly altered form. When originally released, Konami had to make quite a few concessions to the game to get it out on time, so while pretty good, it was far from what they originally conceived, with some unpolished controls and camera implementation bringing it down a bit. Legacy of Darkness added 2 more characters to the game, both of which had their own stories, improved the graphics, tightened the camera and controls, added some new content and revised some of the levels. While often seen as making the original redundant, I wouldn't go quite that far though. There's definitely some trade-offs here, and frankly the improvements probably aren't worth the extra cost that the enhanced version goes for these days. Anyway, as far as the games are concerned, I actually quite like both versions. They're flawed for sure, but they have a lot of good points. The gameplay here I think takes inspiration from Tomb Raider, with a lot of climbing and platforming going on. But unlike later 3D Castlevania games, here it also feels like a lot of effort was put in to translate the series' classic 2D gameplay mechanics into 3D. Oddly enough, it actually feels most like the first NES game to me in some respects, with some brutal sections here even reminding me of the dreaded run-up to the fight against death in that game. The atmosphere, style and music is also pure Castlevania here. I think these games get a bit of a raw deal these days, frankly. At the time they were fairly warmly received by critics, but now, not so much. I think that these were just not the games that fans of the series were looking for at the time, especially coming straight off the back of Symphony of the Night, one of the most beloved games in the whole series. The games are flawed for sure, but I actually find them very enjoyable and memorable too. Quake 2 was a big departure from the first game, having really little in common with it bar the name, the big guns and being a first-person shooter really. Here we have a sci-fi shooter with you navigating space stations taking on an alien menace, and originally this took place in some huge interconnected levels. But actually what we have here is yet another new game, much like Forsaken 64, that was specifically made for the N64 that just shares the name and level themes to the original. The content here is familiar to the PC and PS1 game, but it's really not the same. N64 Quake 2 is an exclusive for the N64 that has a structure that's actually a bit more like a halfway house between the PC game and Doom. Overall the game's a little dated, with the aiming being somewhat imprecise, But there's a lot of good stuff here. The 4-player deathmatch is of high quality, and while perhaps people at the time wanted a true port of the game, nowadays, with easy access to the PC original, I feel that having an exclusive N64 game in the series to add to the others is much more interesting. It was a long time coming, but when the popular futuristic racing series did eventually make it to the N64, it was well worth the wait. Wipeout 64 may not be the greatest Wipeout of its generation, but it's definitely the most underappreciated one. Whilst rarely mentioned, this is actually very competitive with the PlayStation classics, containing all the rewarding gameplay and stylish art design that they became famous for. Wipeout 64 is essentially a rigid combination of the first two Wipeout games, containing altered courses from both games that have been changed to emphasise speed, and with new redesigned environment art. The rejig stages look fantastic, and actually very different to the originals. New analog controls here also give you a glorious feeling of precision in movement. There's an excellent new challenge mode, and this is also the only game in the series to feature a 4-player split screen mode too. Operation Winback is an interesting third-person shooter for the 64 that has shades of Metal Gear Solid style espionage action, and in fact at the time many of the dedicated 64 mags kind of billed it as a Metal Gear Solid substitute. Unfortunately it doesn't quite live up to the moniker, but it does have many good points and has an admirable amount of ideas itself. The game was actually the first I've come across that included some fundamental gameplay mechanics to the genre, primarily the ability to take cover behind objects. And in fact, for a game that was sometimes billed as a Metal Gear Solid knockoff, it's interesting that that series would actually add a very similar cover mechanic to the much heralded PS2 sequel a few years later. The game is a little bit on the hard side, but it provides an excellent adventure with an above average plot, lots of action and some ahead of their time controls. So Harvest Moon 64 is a very addictive simulation game where you have to run a farm, make friends and eventually even get married and have children and such. The game is honestly a lot more fun than it sounds. It's infused with a whole load of charm and is always giving you new things to keep you busy and entertained. This sequel to the SNES original goes quite a bit more in depth than the earlier game, with the developers trying to represent your character with very real world limitations, and these additions serve to make the game a good bit more interesting. Just a likeable game all in all. Praised at the time for its huge scope and technical prowess, Donkey Kong 64 tends to garner a little more mixed reaction these days. The game is a work of pure excess, the idea that more is always better. It includes many times the number of items to find in Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, and pretty much everything that can be collected has to be. Some say the game is simply too big. Personally, I think the problem is more one of pacing. There's just not enough levels here to fit all this stuff into. You end up getting bogged down a bit searching the same levels over and over, instead of moving forwards and seeing new things to keep you interested. On the other side though, there is a lot to like here. Many of the challenges are as fun as you'd expect from Rare, the environments are cool and well designed, and it's certainly technically excellent too. In fact, DK64's greatest strength over its siblings Conker and Banjo-Tooie remains its graphics and frame rate, I feel. Overall it's a bit long and bloated, but for those who love these kinds of games and just have to collect every last thing, this will probably be manna from heaven. After so many terrible comic book license games for the system, I don't think anyone really expected this game from US company Activision to turn out quite as well as it did, but thankfully this was no Superman 64. Here the developers did a great job at recreating the look and feel of the comic books, and transferring the popular character and his famous abilities into a detailed 3D world. The action gameplay here is done really well, and there's some cool stealth elements to the game as well, with you climbing and crawling all over the walls and ceilings of the game. The N64 porters also did a pretty good job overall here, with the biggest omission being the FMV movies, which would have taken up too much space for the N64 cartridge format for their budget. The devs here have however made improvements to the characters' shadows, and of course the environment textures are more stable than in the original PS1 game. So this is actually one of my favourite puzzle games, but it's kind of hard to explain and has a very steep learning curve which unfortunately limits its potential audience. Though saying that, it's actually one of the few Western games that found a dedicated audience in Japan, with Japanese developers largely taking over the duties for the PS2 sequel. So the aim here is to build as many duck ponds as possible, while making sure to stop the water that drops onto the landscape spilling off the edges, and also making sure not to build too much too high, lest you cause an earthquake. The main issue with the difficulty curve is simply that it takes a lot of practice to precisely place the pieces, but there's also a lot of other factors that make an appearance over time that have to be juggled. This N64 game was notable as the first version of the game to make an appearance, but to be honest there were actually very few major changes made to the formula over time, so this remains a great way to play the game. Pilotwings 64 was a beautifully realised N64 launch title, which had you flying in different aircrafts, including auto-gyros, hang gliders and jetpacks, around islands where you need to fulfil a range of different mission objectives. This was actually a sequel to the SNES original. This new one was made by the US company Paradigm though, who'd previously been a company that primarily specialised in designing commercial flight sims for the US Department of Defense, among others. Nintendo contracted them to develop this sequel, and they subsequently shifted their projects towards gaming, going on to develop some other interesting and underrated titles, such as the earlier mentioned Beetle Adventure Racing. I'd say Pilotwings remains their greatest release though. It's a very singular, unique and carefree experience that builds on the original concept beautifully. Worms has always been one of the premier multiplayer strategy games ever since getting released on the Amiga back in 1995. And this iteration of the series, Armageddon, is almost always considered to be one of the greatest games in the series. The game is a turn-based strategy title that is part of the artillery subgenre. You use your team of worms to wipe out the competition using a variety of offbeat weapons, many of which require you to carefully judge the angle and power required to reach your target. Worms really is the king of its subgenre, being packed with a ton of charm and a lot of features and originality. Another memorable game from Rare, Jet Force Gemini is one of their lesser known games, a third-person shooter reminiscent of games like Shiny's MDK, infused with Rare's usual humour and cartoon styling. The game is mainly focused on gung-ho action, with you amassing a variety of fun, overpowered weaponry to deal death and destruction to your enemies, which here is an army of ant-like aliens. There's also ample adventuring elements and other secondary mission objectives to keep you involved along the way. The later game does get dragged down a little with padding, and it's tough to go back to the controls these days, but overall it's a nice change of pace for Rare and definitely a somewhat underrated and influential game. I can definitely see a lot of this game in Insomniac's Ratchet & Clank series, for example. This was an excellent action-adventure game that threw you into a fully formed world of grim horror, violence and intrigue based on the comic book of the same name. It actually feels like a more gritty, horror-themed Ocarina of Time in some ways. The game is fairly tough, with little hand-holding along the way. Make sure you get a copy of the game with a map as well. But it is a well-crafted title for those who like to fully explore and get completely immersed in their games. Unfortunately for Shadow Man, it was actually released at around the same time as the superlative classic Soul Reaver, which was treading much of the same ground, and the comparison was not really that flattering to Shadow Man, unfortunately. The game also suffered from an absolutely abysmal port to the PlayStation that was a complete mess in just about every way, and this likely didn't do its reputation any favours either. The Dreamcast, on the other hand, did end up with a good port of the game, which, while not really pushing the system in any way, was the smoothest and most detailed way to play it at the time. Though for some reason this otherwise great port had some minor audio issues that are not found here in the original. Developers Aki did a great job of transferring the sport of wrestling to gaming form here. So good in fact that they are actually considered to be pretty legendary developers within this niche, with many wrestling fans still waxing lyrical about their N64 output to this very day. Aki's N64 games just have a fantastic and very fun fighting engine and many enjoyable features for the time, such as the ability to create your own wrestler, which was improved further in this one, and great 4-player modes. Outside of the excellent gameplay, the graphics here were always pretty good too, and have done a good job of recreating the look and feel of the show. As said, even today No Mercy is still often touted as being one of the greatest wrestling games ever created, and for good reason too. So here we have another objective-based 3D platformer, a la Mario 64. This time from newly formed developer Sucker Punch, who would go on to swap allegiance to Sony and make the excellent Sly Cooper games, as well as things like Ghost of Tsushima. Unlike many of the other pretenders to the throne, the developers here really tried to think outside of the box, creating a game filled to the brim with puzzles that are both clever and innovative, and a general design that is smart and imaginative. In fact, perhaps it's a little too clever for its own good at times. Some of these puzzles take a lot to work out. Definitely one of the more underrated games on the system, and one of the lesser known games that fans of the system have to check out. It definitely even manages to give Banjo and Mario a run for their money at times. After the huge success of GoldenEye, Rare were predictably outbidded for the James Bond license, and other developers would be charged with following in their footsteps. Hard shoes to fill, to be sure. Out of these subsequent companies, developers Eurocom would actually consistently come back with the best results, with most of the good post-GoldenEye James Bond games coming from them, actually including the Wii's remake of GoldenEye itself many years later. Anyway, as you'd imagine, GoldenEye was a hard game to follow, but it has to be said that Eurocom really gave it their all here, and actually did a pretty good job. Their offering, The World Is Not Enough, is certainly one of the more criminally overlooked first-person shooters of its generation. Also note that this game is an N64 exclusive, The PS1 game was a completely different and vastly inferior game from a different company. The developers follow Rare's lead, with the game closely following the template laid down by GoldenEye, with you playing through a bunch of mission-based stages requiring quick reflexes, stealth and general espionage-inspired gameplay gimmicks. This is probably a controversial opinion, but I do think the single-player experience of Twine has actually dated much better than many of the more revered FPS titles on N64, mainly due to Eurocom's focus on getting the game running smoothly with a good frame rate and clean, detailed graphics. Where the multiplayer is concerned though, it does need to be mentioned that it doesn't quite get to the same lofty heights as GoldenEye, but it's a pretty good effort. Fans of Rare's first-person shooters and their offshoot company Free Radical, the creators of Timesplitters, should definitely check this one out too. One of the most ambitious games of its generation, Body Harvest was DMA Design's first attempt at creating a large 3D open world, with the title having absolutely huge levels that you needed to traverse by foot or in one of the handy vehicles left strewn around the environment. This would be an indication of things to come for the company, as subsequently they would release the mega hit Grand Theft Auto 3, a game which actually probably resembled this as much as it did the previous games in its own series, if not more, with Body Harvest acting as a sort of proof of concept in many ways. The game is, at its heart, a third-person shoot-'em-up with action-adventure elements. It has you trying to stop an alien harvest of the human race. You go back and forth through time, shooting the bug-like aliens and trying to shut down their human-munching operations. The thing that makes it so original is the sheer freedom of choice involved. You get to explore the huge levels however you feel, procuring a multitude of cars, tanks, boats and even airplanes to fulfill your objective. Outside of that though, the game is full of puzzles, fun weapons to use, and whilst not that graphically great, has a lot of atmosphere, with a sinister, sometimes melancholy feel to it. The game had a tumultuous release. It was originally planned as an N64 launch title, but the original publisher, Nintendo, kept sending it back on the grounds of it being too violent. Eventually Nintendo dropped it entirely and DMA had to search for a new publisher, and it ended up getting released 2 years late. Body Harvest takes time to get going and is quite a tough and sometimes unrefined game, but it's an important release that's wide in scope for a company that would become huge shortly later, and it arguably stands as the only real game of its type in the whole generation. The cult classic Japanese developer Treasure make another appearance here, this time to deliver what has to be the system's best 2D platformer. Mischief Makers is a unique, somewhat experimental game that's full of ideas, humour and some of the most memorable boss fights ever conceived. The game focuses on the mechanic of manipulating objects by shaking, throwing and pulling them. This, added to the sheer variety of levels, makes the title a breath of fresh air for the genre that plays like nothing else. All in all, just the sort of interesting release you'd expect from Treasure, and the game's offbeat humour lends it a lot of charm too. Whilst the N64 library is packed with many of the best racing games of its time, realism in the genre is not really the system's forte. World Driver Championship is the main challenger representing this side of the genre, and luckily, while it's no Gran Turismo, it is a legitimately good effort, managing to be one of the most graphically impressive titles of its generation. The game starts off a little slow, with some of the early cars not having the best handling, but give it some time and everything starts to fall into place, revealing a very playable, challenging, in-depth and enjoyable racing experience to get stuck into. This was the final Turok game made for the N64, and the final of the original series of games too. And actually I have to say I think it's probably the most underrated as well. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised at how much easier it was to revisit than the other titles in the series. So where Turok 3 is concerned, I'd say the main influence here was actually Half-Life, which was obviously a big first-person shooter at the time. The game follows a more linear and narrative-driven structure than the previous releases, with you heading through the environments briskly, only stopping to look around and work out where your next route lies. Other than the more modern feeling structure, the game also has a more consistent frame rate than its forebears, and a few more improvements to control as well, now offering the option to completely disable look spring, even when moving. It's a polished and smooth game with some of the most interesting environments of any of the console FPS games of the time, and a new energy grapple is a nice addition to the series that also brings to mind the later Metroid Prime games. Coming very late in the N64's lifespan, Excitebike 64 shot out of nowhere and managed to be one of the finest dirt bike racing games of its time. The game is an update of the excellent NES classic from way back in 1984, but here we have American company Left Field Productions on development duty. This was the company that made the excellent Courtside series. The developers managed to carry on the high pedigree of polish that is expected of a Nintendo license, producing a game with very in-depth terrain-focused races, and it competes very favourably with the other sports races on the system, like Wave Race and 1080. Just like those two classics, Excitebike contains an excellent physics model and intuitive controls that leave a lot of room for mastery and finesse. It's a shame that so few people got to play the game, as sadly most had moved on to newer consoles by the time of its release. So here's the second of only 3 JRPGs to make the list, and it's a strategy focused one. Ogre Battle 64 was from a pretty well respected series, so N64 owners viewed the game's announcement with some anticipation. Thankfully they were not disappointed, unlike the people waiting for the much anticipated N64 Earthbound sequel. The game really lives up to its forebears and serves as the system's primary serious RPG for fans of the genre to sink their teeth into. Ogre Battle's gameplay is focused on tactics. It gives you a large number of units and classes, each with a variety of uses and strengths, and the main crux of the gameplay is in growing and managing these units into an effective army, through careful positioning and purchasing weaponry and armour and such. The game is a meaty adventure, it had a lot of content, is very long and has an in-depth plot which branches off to provide multiple different endings. I think this one has to go down as the strongest of Mario's sport outings for the system. Mario Tennis has you playing some very fun arcade-focused tennis with famous characters from the Mario franchise, with the main influence perhaps being Sega's excellent Virtua Tennis series. The game has all the required elements you'd expect from a fantastic tennis game, with fluid controls, a variety of different shots and multiple court types. The Mario theming is also very well used, with lots of memorable characters available to choose from and some quirky game modes which are a lot of fun too, such as one which has you using collectible items a la Mario Kart. All in all, a very admirable and fun Mario outing, which is great to play both alone and with friends. There's a good case to be made actually that this is also the high point of the series, with subsequent Mario Tennis games losing much of their direction as time went on. Whilst admittedly not the most attractive of races for its time, what F-Zero X lacked in the graphics department, it more than makes up for in the adrenaline-fueled white-knuckle speed department, and the lack of graphical detail functions as a way to help keep that speed running at the super smooth frame rate required for the futuristic racing game, while also allowing for an impressive number of racers taking part, some 30 odd in each race, which was a rarity at the time. The track designs here are inspired, with loads of elaborate tubes and corkscrews to race on, and through, and we get a new exciting shoulder barge style move to allow us to attack the other racers. On top of the aforementioned elements, the music is great and there's loads of content and modes to keep racing fans happy, including a nice 4-player mode. Yet another first-class racer from Nintendo to add to the stack. So this is the first game in what would become a very popular series of Star Wars themed mission-based shooters, from German developers Factor 5, who'd built a name for themselves in Europe with the Turrican series of games. The game is you piloting a variety of beloved craft straight out of the movies. Depending on the stage, you'll be shooting down specified enemies, protecting allies, or tying up the walkers. It was a great start to the series, with most of the elements apparent in later games already well established here, though the recipe would later be honed to perfection ready for the GameCube launch with the impressive sequel, Rogue Leader. It's all well and good jumping around solving puzzles and collecting stars and such, but sometimes you just want an uncomplicated, enjoyable platform romp, and that's exactly what Rayman 2 delivers. The game is just full to the brim with classic 3D jumping action. Not to say that it's cookie cutter though, oh no. Rayman 2 has a lot of variety in its levels and tons of ideas that serve to keep the game interesting throughout. New mechanics here like the awesome grappling hook are a joy to use, with being very exhilarating at the time to swing from point to point through the stages. Outside of the gameplay, the game looks great and all of the characters are imbued with nice designs and a lot of charm. This N64 version of the game is actually the original native version of the game, as Rayman 2 was initially designed for N64 and PC, with the N64 game being released first. And you can tell it was made from the ground up for the 64 as well, as it runs pretty well here. Though of course not quite as well as the later Dreamcast version, it still easily outdoes the PS1 version that was released a year later. This was the game where Rayman really entered the big leagues and arguably remains the peak of the series, easily rivaling even Nintendo and Rare's classic offerings from the time. I'd have to say that this has to be the system's best arcade-style racer. Ridge Racer 64 isn't really a true port of any of the earlier games. Nintendo's NST division, also responsible for later GameCube races 1080 Avalanche and Wave Race Blue Storm, pretty much created this game from the ground up themselves, merely taking some course layouts from Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer Revolution. Ridge Racer 64 plays in a very different manner to those games though, feeling a little more over the top and bombastic, with much more ludicrous and fun drift mechanics and a more clean, almost bordering on cartoony art style. It sometimes feels like the love child of Ridge Racer and Sega's Daytona to be honest. On top of the old courses, you get an excellent brand new area, Desert, with 3 more exclusive tracks. In the battle of the Ridge Racers, I'd have to say that the PS1's Type 4 is the better game, but honestly this is such a different experience that there's no reason to choose one over the other. What an absolutely genius concept for a puzzle game from the ever excellent Rare. The premise here is that there's a runaway truck containing nuclear missiles that's out of control, and it's up to you to clear a path for it using an assortment of vehicles, including some giant Japanese-style mechs, before it crashes and explodes. The level designs are clever and intricate, and the different vehicles here are very varied and fun to use, and sometimes rewarding to master as well, such as with the somewhat controversial Backlash vehicle and its somewhat steep learning curve. All in all, the game is just a lot of fun, and few other games manage to build up anywhere near as much tension, with you often desperately struggling to deal with the last few blocking structures as the truck nears destruction. And overall it stands as one of the more original titles in the N64's library too. Would anyone honestly argue that the Mario Kart series isn't one of the premier multiplayer game experiences ever devised? I think not. And this N64 iteration happens to be possibly my favourite of them all, and was the introduction of the essential 4-player split screen mode, which was the only missing cherry on the top of the cake that was Super Mario Kart. Like all Mario Karts, the game has you racing your opponents, picking up different items to use against each other, a hectic premise for multiplayer shenanigans. Mario Kart 64 has some of the most memorable courses in the series, ranging from simpler courses like Luigi's Raceway, all the way up to the very tricky ones like Banshee's Boardwalk and the hectic mirror mode of Toad's Turnpike. There's even some out-and-out odd ones like the anonymous multipath Yoshi's Valley to add some variety too. And the races actually really do require some skill here. Unlike subsequent games in the series, Mario Kart 64 does not baby the player. Each course promotes a lot of tactical thinking, many include very decisive shortcuts, and in general the game is not forgiving of serious mistakes at all. There's no almost instant respawn from driving off the course here, oh no. My friends and I have played this regularly for years, and I have a lot of happy memories of the game, but in the end I just can't overlook one aspect: the game's poor single player mode, which feels like an afterthought to the admittedly amazing and timeless 4-player experience. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. To me, Smash Bros was probably the most notable fighting game to appear since Street Fighter 2. The game came completely out of the blue with a completely unique, very fun and memorable fighting system, and it was kind of based on sumo of all things, with the main aim being not to deplete your opponent's energy bar, but push them out of the ring instead. Nintendo crafted a supreme 4-player fighting game experience here, allowing you to choose your character from a variety of Nintendo stalwarts. All of the heavy hitters were there, and you and 3 friends were free to beat the heck out of them. The game is very fast and accessible, with everyone bashing each other around the screen, wearing each other down until they can deliver the coup de grace and knock them out of bounds, or waiting at the edge of a platform ready to exploit another player's misfortune and finish them off. It's all great fun, and my friends and I played it religiously almost every day for well over a year during our school days, only stopping when the even better GameCube game arrived. This was the start of what has to be one of the greatest multiplayer gaming series ever created. N64 didn't have many good fighters, but at least I would argue it had one of the best and most original here. So this sequel to the beloved Banjo-Kazooie represented quite an interesting shift for the series, and the game actually really blazes its own trail in many ways. Primarily what Rare did here was to shift the game's balance a little more into the action-adventure genre, with the game almost playing like a 3D Metroidvania at times, but surrounding the core platforming, collecting and puzzle-solving gameplay of the original. The game completely does away with its predecessor's limited and conspicuous hub navigation, replacing it with a much larger, more ambitious world to explore that has a much more seamless transition between the different environments, with the levels not only joining to the main hub, but joining to each other in clever ways too. In fact, clever is a very good word to describe the game in general. The design here is actually quite complex and intricate in many ways. When you start off, you spend a lot of the early part of the game testing ideas and exploring the daunting levels, trying to make sense of the things that you find. But as it goes on, everything just starts to slot into place and you begin to see the bigger picture, and it's all just very, very satisfying to work it all out. Thankfully, the game also retains a lot of the charm and humour of its predecessor, and I think actually improves the plot and script in many ways too, resulting in a funnier game. The controls are further improved on with many new moves, with the ability to fly solo with Kazooie being a real high point. The puzzles are smarter, and there's also a lot of epic boss fights here now too. I do have to say though, for my high opinion of the game, it's far from perfect, which is why it didn't make my top 10. This game starts out slow, and I mean really, really slow, and sadly many people will probably lose interest before they even see a fraction of what it has to offer. But I would really suggest giving this a chance, as what we have here is certainly one of the most ambitious games of the generation, and a game that instills a real sense of wonder and adventure for the player that is quite rare for the time. Before this arrived, I don't think anyone would have believed such an accurate port of Resident Evil 2 could be possible on the N64. The game was very much designed around the strengths of the PS1 and CD format, so fitting all that data onto a cartridge had to be a real feat of programming. especially with how few compromises we find here, and actually even a few improvements. Thankfully, Capcom had the highly talented Angel Studios working on it, and with help from the phenomenal programmers at Factor 5 no less. Resident Evil 2 was the premier survival horror game of its generation, full of memorable characters, tense situations and gruesome monsters. Like all games from the subgenre, you're spending most of your time exploring and doing puzzles, as well as being careful to ration your bullets and health pickups. This N64 game, as already stated, was ported very well. The two biggest issues with it are the FMV movies and the voice acting, which have both been noticeably downgraded. The music, however, sounds fantastic here, so it's clear they prioritised it over those other two elements. Probably a wise decision. The backgrounds are also often higher resolution than the PS1 originals, and there's some interesting new extras and features as well, such as the ability to get rid of the tank controls, and a very well regarded randomizer mode, which placed the items in different positions to change up subsequent playthroughs, as well as new costumes and such. N64 owners couldn't have asked for a better version of the classic, to be honest. This is a good port of the PlayStation Classic starring the famous skateboarder. The Tony Hawk's games essentially have you placed in a bunch of different environments with a set of objectives to fulfill, such as reaching certain points thresholds by doing complicated sequences of tricks, or collecting certain objects and such. The games are very rewarding to practice and learn, with tons of moves available and opportunity for flair throughout. This N64 port was a big improvement over the first game on the system, and is pretty well done overall. The audio is predictably a good bit worse than the PS1 original, unfortunately, but the graphics are smoother and more stable, the frame rate is better, and there's even a new additional area as an extra exclusive. A very respectable port of a stone cold classic. So here we have Nintendo's 1080 snowboarding. This was one of the most important, if not the most important, snowboarding games released during the so-called 5th generation. Most of the other titles of the subgenre of this period were quite lightweight, arcadey affairs with fairly simplistic controls and physics. 1080 on the other hand went the extra mile trying to get the physics, handling and general feel of the board just right, really trying to recreate the feeling of travelling over different types of snow. The developers succeeded admirably here. So word of warning, given the more simish nature of it, this is not really a pick up and play type of game, with misjudging your movements and mishandling your landings often leading to you taking a tumble. But the precision and attention to detail inherent in the game results in a rewarding title that was a lot of fun to practice and master. The sequel, Avalanche on the GameCube, was also a lot of fun, but the sim element was completely dropped there, with the game playing very little like this forebear, having more in common with the arcade snowboard titles like the popular SSX series. So this was an absolutely inspired update of the SNES Classic, and it probably stands as the absolute high point of the series in the minds of most fans, even to this day. So the Star Fox games are all rail shooters that have you piloting a range of different vehicles, with Star Fox 64 giving you access to the classic spaceships we all know and love, as well as tanks and submarines. Generally you control them in a set path blowing up everything you come across, but here there's also some levels that take place in arenas too, which were actually taken from the second game in the series, which was unceremoniously cancelled at the time, and only gained release much later in the SNES Mini. The game here is action-packed and the level designs are varied and never become repetitive. Replayability is also very high due to an addictive combo-based medal system. Essentially you get bonus points for hitting multiple enemies with one shot. If you manage to do this extra objective, you're given a somewhat lightweight but still fun 4-player deathmatch game, which is actually a really good prize. Another true N64 classic. Wave Race was a truly groundbreaking game when originally released back in 1996. Mainly due to the undeniably brilliant for the time water effects and physics, which served to add a new level of depth to the control and feel of the game. And they got the feel of controlling the jet ski and navigating through and around the undulating waves just feeling right and intuitive. The gameplay in general here is just very well judged, and everything has an endearing sunny summer vibe to it that really shines through. Definitely one of my personal favourites in the racing genre. With Banjo-Kazooie, Rare took what was laid down in the superlative Mario 64 and worked to build on that foundation, adding some quirky British humour, tighter controls, more focus on characterisation, an interesting 2-in-1 character design, which we later saw use in the Ratchet & Clank and Jak and Daxter series, and a presentation that was well beyond that of the launch title classic. Well, if it's so great, then why have I placed it lower? Well, of course Mario 64 is the far more influential game. But more than that, Banjo-Kazooie does actually feel a little too much like Mario 64 at times, in my opinion, not straying very far from its main influence. Not that the game doesn't also include its fair share of brilliance though, with the stage Click Clock Wood alone standing as a hugely noteworthy inclusion in the genre, an interesting stage that has you navigating 4 different versions of the environment, taking place during the 4 seasons. where you have to take into account the passage of time to solve the puzzles. Ingenious design for the time. All in all, another must-play 3D platformer for the genre that went on to influence a whole load of what would be the most important platform games in the coming years on the PS2. With Diddy Kong Racing, Rare analysed Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64 and went to town on trying to create the better game. Whether they succeeded or not is perhaps open to debate, but one area that I would say is a clear slam dunk here is the single player experience. Here we have something very different to what seemed like, frankly, an afterthought in Mario Kart 64. The game actually gives you a full hub world to explore, short cutscenes with the characters, true boss fights against memorable opponents that take place in their own dedicated levels, extra challenges within the races to change them up a bit, and even new gameplay modes too. Not only do we get the battle modes from Mario Kart, we also get a sort of capture the flag mode where you collect and deposit eggs. Rare really did completely outdo themselves in this area. Even most later Mario Kart games fail miserably to provide as much single player content as this. In regards to the main gameplay though, we also get more tracks to race on here than in Mario Kart, and more importantly the choice of different types of vehicles to race in, with you able to race planes, cars or hovercrafts, with each vehicle very much changing the experience. Just as soon as you think you've got a handle on the game, it throws you into wave race style courses with their own water physics. Honestly, it's almost like you get 3 different games in one at times, and this multi-vehicle setup would influence many later games as well, including Sega All-Star Racing Transformed and Mario Kart itself. Where it comes to multiplayer shenanigans, I personally do still give the nod to Mario Kart 64 though. The power-ups here are more technical and skill-based, but I find they result in less exciting races. Still, the game remains a lot of fun in multiplayer. It has more options than Mario Kart, and people who want more skill-based racing will probably like it better too. And where the single-player adventure is concerned, it's arguably remained unbeaten in the subgenre even to this day. So Sin and Punishment is an import-only N64 game that is the third and final game from Treasure on the list. It has you controlling 2 rebel heroes as they plough through armies of monsters and soldiers, destroying everything in their path. The game is a rail shooter, so you move along a set path, only really needing to focus on bullet dodging and aiming your cursor. Here you also get a close quarters melee attack that can rebound powerful enemy shots to do more damage, which is very cool to use. The title is definitely among the best action games of its generation, with excellent controls, a great over-the-top plot, and some of the most memorable set pieces to ever grace a game. It's also one of the most impressively programmed games on the system. The audio is first rate, with brilliant voice acting, which is all actually in English I might add, and very high quality music. And it also serves as one of the most graphically detailed and vibrant N64 games out there as well. All these elements add up to make Sin and Punishment one of the best rail shooters ever created. Treasure at their very best. Coming in the wake of Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask provided a much darker and more moody experience than its N64 sibling, but one equally excellent. It managed to squeeze even more out of the 64 with even better graphics this time around, and with what is, in my opinion, far superior art design as well, and also added in a bunch of cool new ideas of its own. The gameplay here is conceptually quite interesting. It revolves around a 3-day system. Time moves forward as you play, and at the end of the 3rd day the world always ends, forcing you to time travel to the first day again, hopefully having achieved something concrete that will aid you in your quest. Many puzzles also require you to do certain things on certain days, which really adds to the game's depth. It admittedly doesn't have as many dungeons as Ocarina, but the side quests here are also fun and memorable to play through. I feel that in regards to atmosphere and plot, this game is second to none for its time though. The world and the people living in it are very fleshed out, and it's all imbued with a very melancholy atmosphere. You really do feel as though you're watching the final days of people's lives play out before the end. I actually think I personally prefer the game to Ocarina in a lot of ways, but I can't really ignore the fact that this blatantly reuses a hell of a lot of assets from that game, even to the extent that it does feel like a repackage of Ocarina at times. And of course on top of that, Ocarina was the big originator here. So for those reasons I've decided to put this lower, but only by a hair's breadth. Does anyone really need an introduction to GoldenEye? Arguably the N64's biggest killer app, GoldenEye was just so far ahead of every other console FPS in the highly popular genre when it came out, and for years afterwards in fact, and it brought a much needed, completely different audience to the system than the usual Nintendo stalwarts. The milestone release amazed gamers on release with its stealthy, mission-based gameplay and multitude of different features, many of which, such as the sniper rifle with scope and limb-specific damage, have been taken from the very latest in the PC multiplayer modding scene, from games like Quake, and of which Rare had carefully incorporated into the single-player campaign mode here, designing the level layouts to use them to their utmost. The guards here, whilst being done by today's standards, were also very well done at the time, Many were instilled with their own mannerisms and quirks, and reacted to you walking in front of cameras and such. This led to a game where you could really feel like a secret agent for the first time, crawling through ducts, taking out unsuspecting enemies from afar with a sniper rifle, and systematically destroying the cameras to hide your position. The multiplayer was really the area where GoldenEye cemented itself as a killer app though. With the awesome split screen option, 4 players could battle it out in some very elegantly designed arenas for the first time on console, and the replay value of the game due to this mode was through the roof. On the more negative side, I will say that these days the game is a bit dated. Many of the features found within have become commonplace in FPS games now, and as such will not retain the level of impact that they once had. It's also my belief that its unofficial sequel, Perfect Dark, has retained more of its uniqueness and also had a lot of major improvements made to what was pioneered here too, so I've dropped it a few places due to these factors. Paper Mario takes pride in place as the best RPG on the N64. Though the N64 isn't really known for its RPGs, Paper Mario is a very high quality one. The battle system looks fairly simple on the outside and is very easy for beginners to pick up, but it's very accessible, a lot of fun, and there are other tactics for older players to try out too. Said battle system is based on using the most effective moves and carefully timing your button presses to make sure your attacks and blocks are more effective. Badges can also be discovered in the game that are equipped for a variety of different abilities and effects. The game contains a lot of memorable Mario elements and has no small measure of charm. The graphics are bright and colourful, the story is fun, and unlike a lot of traditional RPGs out there, here you get to do loads of puzzles throughout the dungeons to keep your brain on its toes. I think 2D Zelda sort of puzzles. This factor, as well as the lack of random encounters, make the game very easy to pick up and play, making it a title that should definitely be checked out by both RPG fans and non-fans alike. I'm not sure if it's a controversial pick to place this over GoldenEye. Probably. But Rare built on their earlier FPS classic in virtually every respect here, and then threw in more options and extras than anyone could have ever imagined, so placed higher it is. Not only did I feel that the whole campaign mode was that little bit more consistently brilliant here, with its varied, memorable stages filled with action and stealth that really rewarded the player for thinking strategically about their course of action, but I found the sci-fi settings and weapons allowed for far more imagination and resulted in guns and environments that were a lot more unique and memorable. The whole thing could also be played in both split-screen co-op and a new novel idea with split-screen counter-op too, which gave one player control over the NPCs during the campaign mode, a masterstroke. Where the multiplayer was concerned, we also had some excellent new options, with the ability to add and customise AI bots to play against or to bolster your teams in one of the multitude of different gameplay modes. Though of course many a player lacking in restraint would unwisely abuse this option to absurd levels, adding far too many bots for the game to deal with. But it was nice to leave the player with so much control. Many other FPS games honestly didn't even come close to the sheer number of options here for years to come. Simply a phenomenal game that, due to its lateness of release, never quite got the credit it deserved, and then the series would sadly get derailed immediately afterwards. So here in third we have Conker's Bad Fur Day. This was just simply a huge, enjoyable and often shocking romp through pastiches of everyone's favourite movies. The game infamously started out as a cutesy platform game starring a happy-go-lucky squirrel, but after the game went through a lot of delays, leading to a number of similar games being it to the market, including Rare's own Banjo-Kazooie, a game that actually started to take shape later than Conker and took a lot of its influence from it, but somehow managed to beat it to market by years. The Conker team decided to change things up, almost certainly taking influence from the controversial American TV show, South Park, which was starting to find a lot of popularity at this stage. The game brought a lot of what Rare had learnt about making platformers together to create a big, highly ambitious game filled with variety. There's a very memorable plot here, which whilst maybe not the most cohesive, was just totally engaging and consistently funny. Some of the best graphics to be seen on the system, with great texture work and lots of impressive effects such as motion blurring, lighting and dynamic shadows. Some astonishing audio work, including full voice acting with lip syncing and dynamic music that changed as you moved around the environment. And there's a load of excellent multiplayer modes thrown in for good measure too. The core gameplay is still based around the Mario 64 template, but here is a little more linear and pacey. The game's detractors often characterise it as a childish game of gross-out humour and nothing else, but really this is a bit reductive. The humour here is quite varied. There's a lot of movie spoofing going on, including an absolutely iconic Clockwork Orange opening, and there's also quite a bit of satire regarding the tropes of video gaming too, with a lot of breaking the fourth wall going on. Anyone familiar with the old website list will know that I actually controversially placed this as my number one N64 game back in 2009, in one of the first lists I made for the site. While I still love the game, I do feel now that it does somewhat fall down in the area of replayability. Once you've seen the outlandish scenarios and heard all the gags, it definitely does lose its lustre a little in comparison to the next two games on the list, both of which can be revisited time and time again and still show the player something new that they hadn't seen before. But still, Conker remains a technical tour de force for the system, and thematically, I honestly, even decades after its release, struggle to even think of any game on the market that's quite like it. Who out there can really say they weren't astounded when they first saw this all-time classic in action? Mario 64 is easily one of the most influential games ever made. It brought new levels of control and immersion to the 3D platformer, giving you free rein to explore its fully realised 3D world. You could creep, jog or run through the stages, due to the well-implemented analog controls, and it provided you with a myriad of different jumps and manoeuvres crafted to fit every occasion. The game's manually controlled camera was a masterstroke here too. Most of the earlier 3D platformers were either static or followed behind the player at all times, but with Mario 64, Nintendo gave the player access to a camera that they could shift to their own preferences, to help with judging some of those fiendish jumps. Apart from those technical elements and features, the game's levels are just well designed in general, and are a lot of fun to explore, filled with variety, ideas and memorable set pieces. Who can forget the first time they took to the skies with a flying cap, for example, or swung Bowser around in circles and flung him to his doom? The game's soundtrack was often flat out timeless as well. As said, easily among the most influential games ever made, and one of the few games out there where most of its entire genre ended up taking some level of influence from it. And predictably, in the number one spot we have Ocarina of Time. After Mario 64 set the bar for what you could do with a 3D environment, Ocarina managed to raise the bar even higher, arguably doing as much for the 3D action-adventure genre as Mario 64 had done for platformers, and creating a much more cohesive experience to boot. Gone were the thinly veiled teleporters of Peach's castle, to be replaced with a full 3D overworld, littered with dungeons and villages to explore. Each dungeon here has been carefully and intelligently crafted, and actually going back to it now, they feel more complex and challenging to navigate than those found in most modern games, which I feel have shifted in balance to being more accessible, but by extension also less complex and more handholdy. Visual cues don't plaster all of the puzzle elements here. No, the player has to fully explore, investigate and experiment with the environment. The control system here is also quite interesting. The game de-emphasises platforming aspects, with Link actually auto-jumping when you run up to a gap, while putting more into combat with a new targeting system that was applauded at the time. This system allowed you to get a lock on and rotate around the enemy, delivering blows and blocking. An elegant system that allows for some really dynamic battles. Ocarina of Time more than deserves its reputation as one of the best releases of all time. Personally, I recommend checking out the original Gold Cart version of the game, as later versions were a little censored and lost some of their bite. Well, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, then please like and subscribe, and maybe consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description. See ya!